In this problem, we have the function y equals tangent x divided by 4 plus 4 secant x. We're asked to find dy dx, which is the derivative. And since this is a quotient, meaning we have a function on top and a function on bottom, numerator, denominator, then this is the formula to find the derivative. Derivative of the top function times the bottom minus the top function times the derivative of the bottom divided by the bottom squared. Okay, so first thing that we probably want to look at is if f of x is equal to tangent x, then what is f prime of x? Just so we can do some work before we start plugging in stuff over here. So the derivative of tangent is secant squared x. Okay, now we have g of x, which is the denominator, 4 plus 4 secant x, which means that g prime of x, we can do that term by term. The derivative of 4 is 0, so we don't need to write it. And then the derivative of secant x, 4 secant x, is secant tangent. So 4 secant x tangent x. Okay. Now we have all that written down. We can go ahead and plug into the formula here. We have f prime g, f, g prime. So let's go ahead and write it down. So dy dx is equal to secant squared x times 4 plus 4 secant x minus tangent x times 4 secant x tangent x. And that's all divided by g of x squared, so this squared, so 4 plus 4 secant x squared. Okay, now that is technically the derivative. Technically that's the answer, but we're not going to leave it that way. When you take derivatives like this, especially when you're dealing with quotient product, chain rule, you need to clean it up afterwards. You're expected to simplify it as much as you can before you submit your final answer. So let's start multiplying through some things and seeing if we can reduce anything. So secant x times 4 is, or secant squared x times 4 is 4 secant squared x. That's here. Okay, and then here we've got secant squared x times 4 secant x. So that is plus 4 secant cubed x. Okay, now here, this is tangent x times 4 secant tangent. So this is, there's one term inside this parentheses and one term inside this parentheses. So when we multiply it, we still are only going to get one large term. So it's going to be minus 4 secant x tangent squared x. It's squared because tangent times another tangent. Divided by 4 plus 4 secant x squared. Okay, so it doesn't look like anything readily reduces yet. So we're going to need to do a little bit more work before we can find anything that reduces. So let's look at the numerator. Is there anything I can factor out of all three of these terms? This one, and this one. Well, it looks like they all have a 4. And they all also have a secant. Now, this one has a secant squared, this one has a secant cubed, and this one has just a secant. So the biggest thing that we can factor out of all three is just secant. So we're going to factor out a 4 and a secant out of the numerator, so that will give us 4 secant x. That goes out front. And then on the inside, what does that give us? Well, we have the 4's gone, one of the secants is gone, so that's just secant x. The 4 is gone and one of the secants is gone, so that's just secant squared x. And then the 4 is gone and one of the and the secant is gone, so that's just minus tangent squared x. Okay, so we might need to do a little bit more work on this to reduce this. Let's go ahead and replace the, oh, you know what, let's go ahead and write the denominator first. Don't want to miss that. Okay, so let's go ahead and replace the tangent squared x with secant squared x minus 1. That's a trig identity. And let's see what happens there. So we have, and we might actually should have done that earlier. So let's see what happens when we do that. Sometimes when you're working with trig functions, you don't see exactly what you're supposed to do until you get in the middle of the problem. And that could be the case here. So this is secant squared x minus 1. 4 plus 4 secant x squared. Okay, so what that did for us is that when we distribute this negative sign here, it becomes a negative secant squared x, and this becomes a positive 1. Okay, so given that, this is going to cancel with this, and we're going to be left with a positive 1 on the inside. So we get equals 4 secant x, and then on the inside we get secant x plus 1 all over 4 plus 4 secant x squared. Now, what I was talking about, seeing what you need to do once you get in the middle of the problem sometimes, is I can see that something's going to cancel here, but we should leave the 4 unfactored. So I'm going to undo this. I took the 4 out earlier. I'm going to put the 4 back in. So I'm going to leave the secant x out front, but inside I'm going to get a 4 secant x plus 4. And the reason I did that, well, you'll see in a second. 4 plus 4 secant x is because this term and this term are the same. Now the bottom one is getting squared, but we can reduce one of them. And just because the 4 didn't come first, you can write the 4 first if you want. So this is going to reduce with one of these, so that's a power of 1, so I don't need to write it. So that looks like that's it for this problem. Once we reduce that, it's as simple as we can get it. So it becomes secant x over 4 plus 4 secant x.